The water was already at the fence posts when Rebecca Talmadge told Eli Malone that she was leaving. Not because she wanted to, not because the work was finished, but because he had just looked her dead in the eye, jaw tight as a bear trap, and told her that he did not need a woman from the government telling him what to do with his land. The words had landed like a slap across still water, sending ripples through everything she had built in the 3 weeks since she had ridden onto the Malone Ranch with her transit level strapped to her saddle and her survey notebooks tucked into her saddlebag. 3 weeks of wading through the flood-ruined bottom pasture in her tall leather boots. 3 weeks of driving stakes into the sodden earth at precise intervals, measuring the new course of Copper Creek, calculating the pressure differentials that had caused the old channel to collapse. 3 weeks of sleeping in the bunkhouse loft, eating beside a man who said fewer words than a stone fence but watched her with a pair of dark brown eyes that seemed to be cataloging every move she made. And now this. Rebecca stood ankle-deep in the cold runoff, her leather satchel slung across her chest, her dark hair plastered to the side of her face by the wind that was building in the west, and she stared at Eli Malone with a fury that was almost indistinguishable from heartbreak. "You don't understand what I'm telling you," she said, and her voice was perfectly level, which was the most dangerous thing about her. "If you drive those levee posts in the location your foreman marked, you will be pushing the new channel directly into the foundation of your south barn by next spring. The water does not care about your pride, Mr. Malone. It will take what you give it." He took a step toward her, his boots sinking into the mud, and for a moment he looked like he might actually listen. He was tall, broad across the chest, with hands that had been hardened by 20 years of roping and fencing and hauling. His dark hair was damp at the temples and a scar ran along his jaw that she had been too careful not to stare at. He looked like the land itself, she had thought more than once, stubborn and permanent and quietly magnificent. "I have been running this ranch for 15 years, he said. "My father ran it before me and his father before him. I have watched every flood and every drought this creek has ever thrown at us." "And yet," Rebecca said, holding his gaze, "the creek rerouted." The silence that followed that sentence was so complete that she could hear the water moving around her boots. He looked away first. She picked up her saddlebag and started walking toward the hitching post where her roan mare Scout was tied. It was Eli's foreman, a wiry, gray-bearded man named Hatch Drummond, who finally cracked the standoff. He came running from the direction of the barn, his hat in his hand, his face pale under his tan. "Boss," Hatch called out, breathing hard. "The south fence line is gone, the whole lower corner. The water is moving into the cattle pens." Eli turned. Rebecca stopped walking. She turned back around. "How long ago?" she asked Hatch, stepping past Eli entirely. Hatch blinked at her. "Ma'am, maybe 10 minutes. Which direction is the breach running, east or northeast?" "Northeast, I'd say, right toward the pens." Rebecca was already pulling her field notebook from her satchel and flipping to a page covered in her precise, tight handwriting and small, careful diagrams. She had mapped this. She had mapped all of it. 3 weeks ago, when she had first arrived and walked the entire perimeter of the property alone in the early morning hours before anyone else was awake, she had seen the indicators that the main channel was under stress. She had documented them. She had written a report. She had tried to give that report to Eli Malone, and he had set it on his desk without reading it. The betrayal of that moment, watching the pages sit untouched, had fueled some of her best measurement work. "There is a gravel ridge running northeast from the base of the old oxbow," she said, and she was speaking to Hatch because Hatch would listen. "If your men can get a line of sandbags along the top of that ridge right now, you will redirect the flow away from the pens and toward the natural depression on the east side of the lower pasture. That depression will hold the overflow without damage. The ridge will hold. The gravel substrate is stable." Hatch looked at Eli. Eli looked at Rebecca. "How sure are you?" Eli asked. "Completely," she said without hesitation, meeting his eyes. He held her gaze for what felt like a full minute. Then he turned to Hatch. "Get every man we have. Sandbags from the tool shed. Follow her directions exactly." He said the last 3 words as though they cost him something. Rebecca was already moving. It had begun 12 days earlier with a telegram. Rebecca Talmadge had been in her rented room at the surveying office in Cheyenne, Wyoming, when the message arrived from the United States Geological Survey field office in Laramie. She was 29 years old, the daughter of a cartographer father who had taught her to read topographic maps before she could read primers, and a botanist mother who had instilled in her the belief that the landscape always told its own story if you knew how to listen. She had studied hydrology under Professor Aldous Crane at the Wyoming Territorial Normal School, had spent 4 years surveying water systems for the federal government, and had a reputation in the field offices of 3 territories as the person you sent when the problem was genuinely difficult. The telegram had read, Copper Creek Rerouting Incident NEAR Prospect Hollow, Malone Ranch FLOODED. Rancher requesting federal assessment. You are nearest qualified surveyor. Depart SOONEST. She had been on the road by dawn the next morning. The Malone Ranch sat in a wide valley south of Prospect Hollow, hemmed in on 3 sides by low rolling hills covered in shortgrass and sage. Copper Creek had once run in a gentle arc through the northwestern corner of the property, providing reliable water for the cattle and the household wells, before disappearing into a series of beaver-dammed pools at the edge of the Drummond family's adjoining land to the east. But the previous winter had been brutal, a brutal season of freeze and thaw cycles that had weakened the creek's banks, followed by a spring flood of unusual force that had carved a new channel through the middle of the ranch's most productive pasture land. The result was that approximately a third of the Malone Ranch's bottom acreage was now under intermittent water. The old channel had silted over and was becoming a bog, and the new channel was unpredictable enough that cattle were in constant danger of being trapped in waterlogged pens when the rains came. Rebecca had seen worse. She had seen catastrophic redirections of the Green River's tributaries that had swallowed entire homesteads. She had seen the aftermath of channelization projects that had turned productive farmland into permanent marshes. She knew that what had happened to Copper Creek was, from a hydrological standpoint, entirely predictable and entirely fixable. The creek wanted to go somewhere. The question was how to negotiate with it. What she had not anticipated was Eli Malone. She had anticipated a rancher. She had assumed the kind she had dealt with before, suspicious of federal involvement, unwilling to hear about the permanence of geological change, committed to the idea that stubbornness was a form of strategy. She had her professional armor ready. She had her credentials. She had her patience. She had not anticipated someone who would look at her arrival with Scout loaded with survey equipment and say, quietly, "You know how to use all of that." Not in a dismissive way, in a way that suggested he was genuinely assessing whether she did. She had looked at him from the saddle with her level expression in place. "Better than anyone you can get from the county office," she said, "which is why they sent me and not someone from the county office." He had looked at her for another long moment. Then he had said, "Hatch will show you where to put your gear," and walked back toward the barn. It was not warmth. But it was not dismissal either, and she had learned to read the spectrum between those two things. The first week, they had barely spoken directly. She worked from sunup to sundown, moving across the property with her hand level and her surveyor's rod driving stakes, recording measurements in her notebook with the pencil she kept tucked behind her ear. The ranch hands watched her with varying degrees of skepticism. Hatch, who turned out to be more curious than his weathered exterior suggested, occasionally handed her a stake without being asked and began to ask questions that were actually intelligent. Eli watched from a distance. She noticed him watching. She was trained to notice things. On the 4th day, she was wading across the new channel at the point where it curved most sharply when her boot slipped on the submerged gravel and she went down to one knee, catching herself with her transit rod before the current could take her sideways. She was up in seconds, soaked to the hip, and when she looked toward the bank she found Eli standing there. He had taken 2 steps toward the water and then stopped. He was watching her with an expression that was, she thought, almost like something had been decided inside him against his will. She gave him one short nod to indicate she was fine. He gave her one short nod back and walked away. They did not speak about it. The first real conversation happened on the 6th evening after supper, when she was sitting on the porch steps with her notebook spread around her and the lamp on the rail casting its amber circle over the pages. She heard the door open and the boards settle under his weight, and then he sat down on the upper step beside her without asking and without explanation. She kept working. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "What are you looking at?" She turned the notebook toward him. On the page was a detailed map of the property, marked with the creek's old channel in one set of marks and the new channel in another, with elevation numbers penciled in at each measurement point. Arrows showed predicted water movement under different rainfall conditions. It was dense and precise, and she had been looking at it for 20 minutes. "This is where the water is going," she said, pointing to the northeast corner. "And this is where it wants to go, given half a reason." She moved her finger to the natural depression she had identified. "These are not the same place. Right now they are close enough that small interventions can make the difference. In 2 or 3 years, if nothing is done, they will not be." He leaned in to look at the map, and she was suddenly very aware of how close he was, the warmth of him in the cooling evening air, the faint smell of horses and clean sweat and the pine tar soap she had seen on the washstand beside the barn. She kept her expression neutral and professional. "What kind of interventions?" he asked. This, she realized, was the first time he had asked a question that was not a challenge. "I'll have a full proposal ready in another week," she said. "Once I've finished the survey of the upper reach." He nodded slowly. He was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, "You do this for other ranches too?" "For anyone who has a water problem and a federal connection," she said. "Farms, ranches, town water supplies. Last year I spent 4 months redirecting a silted-up irrigation channel on the North Platte for 3 homesteaders who were about to lose their crops. Year before that I was working on a dam assessment for the railroad." "Do they listen to you?" The question surprised her into a brief pause. "Some do," she said honestly. "Some don't." He was quiet again. He seemed to be thinking about something. The night insects were starting up in the grass beyond the fence, and the sky was that deep violet color that only happens in open country. "My father lost 20 head of cattle in a flood in '81, he said. "He drove posts for 3 weeks afterward trying to shore up the bank. It never held the way he thought it would. What he drove those posts into was silt over old channel sediment," she said, before she could stop herself. "It has no structural integrity. It looks solid because it compresses under pressure, but water finds the gaps. You need to anchor into the gravel substrate underneath." Eli looked at her with that expression again, the one that was almost something against his will. "How do you know what's underneath without digging it up?" She picked up one of her other notebooks and opened it to a page where she had documented her probe samples. She had been pushing a steel measuring rod into the ground at intervals across the property and recording the resistance at each depth, building a subsurface picture. "Resistance profiles," she said. "The rod tells me what it's passing through. I've been doing this for 4 years. You develop a sense for it." He took the notebook from her hands carefully and studied the page. His hands were very large and the notebook looked small in them. He turned a page and then another. "This is the south pasture?" he asked, pointing. "Yes. That clay layer at 18 inches is what's holding the bog from draining. If we cut a simple drainage channel through it at this point here, the bog dries out within a season." He looked up from the notebook, and she found herself looking directly at him, closer than she had expected. There were lines around his eyes that she had not noticed before, the kind made by squinting into years of western sun, and they made him look like someone who had seen a great deal and kept most of it quiet. He handed the notebook back. "I'll read your proposal," he said, and went inside. It was not a declaration of trust, but it was a beginning. The second week was where the real battle lines were drawn, and they were not drawn by the water. Eli had a neighbor named Gareth Pressler who owned the land that ran along the northern edge of the Malone property, above the point where Copper Creek entered the valley. Pressler had come to the ranch on a Tuesday morning, riding a well-fed bay horse and wearing the kind of smile that makes people want to check their pockets. Rebecca was measuring the upper reach of the new channel when she heard him arrive. She could see the conversation from 50 yards away, Pressler doing most of the talking, Eli listening with his arms folded, Hatch hovering nearby with the expression of a man who does not like what he is hearing. Afterward, when Pressler had ridden out and Eli came to find her at the channel, she could read the controlled anger in the set of his shoulders. "What did he want?" she asked. Eli looked at the water. "He says the rerouting is my fault. Claims I put up a rock deflector in the creek bed 6 years ago that destabilized the channel over time. He's talking about bringing a lawsuit for the floodwater that crossed onto his northern parcel." Rebecca put her hands on her hips. "Did you put up a rock deflector?" "A small one, for cattle watering. It was standard practice." She was already running the mathematics in her head. A rock deflector that size would not have the structural impact to redirect a channel of Copper Creek's volume. The actual cause was the bank collapse at the Oxbow Bend during the February thaw. I have the sediment evidence. The bank failure was driven by freeze-thaw cycling in the clay matrix, not by any human intervention. Eli looked at her sharply. "You can prove that." "I have 3 weeks of data and 4 core samples that prove it," she said. "The natural record is all there. When did the February thaw happen?" "The middle of the month. 15th, 16th. The bank failure happened within 48 hours of that thaw. I can read it in the exposed sediment layers at the collapse point. The old channel walls show a clear slump feature that is characteristic of freeze-thaw failure, not mechanical deflection." She was already walking toward her survey stakes at the Oxbow. "Come and I'll show you." He followed her without hesitation, which was itself a small revelation. At the collapsed bank, she pulled back the grass she had weighted over one of her sample holes and showed him the layered sediment profile she had exposed and documented. She pointed out the slump line, the ice lens cavities in the clay that had melted and left voids, the way the collapse had propagated from a point well above the waterline. Eli crouched beside the hole and looked at what she was showing him with complete attention. She explained each layer and what it indicated. He asked questions, real ones, the kind that told her he was building an understanding rather than just waiting for her to finish. When she was done, he stood up slowly and looked at the creek. "So Pressler has no case," he said. "He has no geological case," she said. "Which is the only case that matters when the cause is a natural channel migration. I would testify to that finding before any court in the territory." Eli looked at her then, and for the first time she saw something in his face that was not controlled and not distant. It was the open expression of a man who has received an unexpected gift and is not sure what to do with it. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "Because it's the truth," she said simply. "And because I don't allow my findings to be used to harm someone they should be protecting." He was quiet for a moment. "You wrote all of this down already," he said. It was not a question. "Every bit of it," she said. "It's in my field report." The report he had not read. She did not say that last part. She did not have to. He looked away again and she thought she saw the edge of something that might have been embarrassment cross his face. He turned back. "I'd like to read the full report," he said. "Tonight, if that's acceptable." "I'll have it on your desk after supper," she said. He nodded. She turned back to the sample hole and began carefully replacing her grass cover over it, protecting the sediment evidence. She heard him walk a few steps away and then stop. "Miss Talmadge," he said. She looked up. "I apologize," he said, "for not reading it sooner." She looked at him steadily. "I appreciate that, Mr. Malone." He nodded once more and walked back toward the house, and Rebecca turned back to her work with the sudden, irrelevant, and extremely inconvenient awareness that she had been holding her breath. The 3rd week was when everything came to its crisis. The rains that had been threatening from the west for days finally arrived on a Wednesday morning, heavy and relentless, the kind of rain that flattens the grass and turns the dirt roads into orange clay rivers. Rebecca was up before dawn, as she always was in storm conditions, standing at the window of the bunkhouse loft watching the sky and doing rapid calculations based on the watershed area she had mapped and the soil saturation levels she had been monitoring. The numbers concerned her. She pulled on her oilskin coat and went down to find Eli already in the yard, standing in the rain without a hat, looking at the creek channel with an expression she had learned to read as contained urgency. She stood beside him and they both looked at the water. "It's moving faster than yesterday," he said. "It will continue to accelerate for at least 6 hours after the rain stops," she said. "The saturated hillside above the oxbow is going to shed water at a high rate. That's where the pressure will build. How high will it go?" She ran the numbers in her head one more time. "Past the fence posts in the lower corner, maybe as far as the cattle pens if the channel can't carry the volume." He turned to look at her with flat-out alarm that he did not try to hide. There were 60 head of cattle in those pens waiting for the rain to ease before they were moved to the high pasture. 60 head and the fencing that represented 2 seasons of work. "What do we do?" he asked. She realized in the brief interior moment that followed that those 3 words represented more than a practical question. He was asking her, without qualification, without caveat, without looking past her to Hatch. He was asking her what to do with 60 cattle and a flooding creek and rain that was not stopping. "We need to start the sandbag line now, before the channel rises to its critical point," she said. "I'll show you exactly where. The gravel ridge I mapped on the east side will give us a natural foundation, which means we won't need as many bags as you'd think. The bags reinforce the ridge. The ridge does most of the work." "How many bags?" 200 at least." "Can you get them?" "We have 400 in the tool shed. Bought them in '88 after a bad summer." "Good." She was already turning toward the barn. "Get your men, all of them. I need to be at the ridge point to direct placement. Every bag needs to go exactly where I say or the line breaks." She was moving through the mud at a fast walk, and she heard him right behind her, already calling out for Hatch. What followed was 3 hours of hard physical labor in cold rain. Rebecca stood at the critical junction of the gravel ridge and the new channel, her notebook folded into her coat pocket, directing the placement of every sandbag with precise instructions. She knew the load-bearing characteristics of the substrate beneath them, and she knew the hydrostatic pressure that the rising water would exert, and she knew exactly how wide and how high the bag wall needed to be to redirect rather than dam. Damming was the wrong strategy. Every amateur response to flooding tried to stop the water. Rebecca's approach was to guide it, to give it a path of least resistance that happened to be the path of least damage. The sandbag wall was not a dam. It was a deflector, angled to push the rising flow toward the natural depression on the east side while protecting the fence line and the cattle pens on the west. Eli worked alongside his men, carrying bags, setting them to her instructions, moving without complaint through the mud and rising water. She watched him work out of the corner of her eye when she could afford to. He was extraordinarily strong, moving bags that 2 of the other men struggled with, and he had the kind of focused efficiency that came from years of physical work that mattered. He also, she noticed, never questioned a single instruction she gave during those 3 hours. At the point when the creek crested, she felt the tension in the sandbag line like a physical pressure, watching the water push at the wall they had built. For 30 seconds she held her breath, reading the water's behavior, watching the point where the deflection either worked or failed. It worked. The water turned. It moved along the ridge, following the angle of the bags, and spilled into the eastern depression exactly as her calculations had predicted it would. The fence line on the west side remained above water. The cattle pen stayed dry. The barn was never in danger. Eli stood in the rain watching the water go where she had said it would go. The men around her were breathing hard and looking at each other with the expressions of people who have just watched a near thing become a safe thing. Hatch took off his hat in the rain and held it against his chest. Eli turned from the water and looked at Rebecca. She had never seen that expression on a man's face before, not directed at her. It was total. It was the expression of someone who has just witnessed something they did not fully expect to be possible, and who is recalibrating everything they thought they knew in its light. He walked toward her through the mud, and when he reached her he stopped, and he looked at her for a long moment, and the rain fell on both of them. "Miss Talmadge," he said, and his voice had changed. Something in it was stripped back to something simpler and more honest than she had heard from him before. "I owe you my ranch. You owe me sound water management practices going forward," she said, but she could hear that her own voice was not entirely steady. He almost smiled. It transformed his face so completely that she felt it as a physical sensation. "That too," he said. Hatch let out a sound that was half laugh and half relief, and the men around them relaxed by degrees, and Rebecca turned back to the water to give herself a moment she did not have the right to need. The days that followed the flood were quieter and warmer, and the distance between Rebecca and Eli Malone contracted in the way that distance between two people contracts when they have been through something difficult together, and survived it with their respect for each other intact. She continued her work. She finished the full survey of the watershed. She completed the drainage channel design for the South Pasture Bog. She drafted the comprehensive creek management proposal that laid out a 7-year approach to stabilizing the new channel, preventing future undercutting of the banks, and restoring the productivity of the bottom pasture through a combination of engineered redirection and native grass replanting. And in the evenings, Eli began to come and sit with her on the porch steps. He asked questions. Real questions, the kind that required her to think before she answered. He wanted to understand the mechanics of what the creek had done and why, not just the immediate solutions but the underlying science. He had a mind that was quicker than his silence suggested, and she found herself genuinely engaged in the conversations in a way that surprised her. She was accustomed to explaining her work to people who were politely tolerant of it. She was not accustomed to explaining it to someone who asked the question she had not thought of yet. On one of those evenings, she said something that had been true since the beginning. "Most people I work with," she said, watching the last light drain out of the sky, "see the creek as a problem to be solved, like it's doing something wrong. But the creek isn't doing anything wrong. It's doing exactly what water does. The question is always how the land and the people on it can work with what water needs, not against it." Eli was quiet for a moment. "My father saw it the same way you described," he said, "as a problem to be defeated. He spent a lot of effort on battles he didn't need to fight." She looked at him. "He was a good man," he said, in the careful way people say true things about complicated people they have loved. "But he was not much for compromise, with the land or with anything else." "What happened to him?" she asked, and because the evening had become the kind of quiet that makes questions feel safe, he answered. "He died in '86. It was his heart. He was 53. He paused. "He had been trying to win an argument with this land his whole life. I think maybe that's what used him up." She sat with that for a moment. "And you?" she asked. He looked at her with an expression that was direct in a way she had come to realize was the truest version of him. "I am trying not to make the same mistake," he said. She thought about that long after she went in that night. She thought about it while she lay in her bunk in the loft and looked at the dark above her and listened to the nighthawks calling outside. The mistake of fighting what could be worked with. The mistake of choosing battle over understanding. She knew something about that herself, though her version of it looked different. Her version was keeping every relationship at the professional distance where it could not get complicated. It was the armor of competence and the shield of neutrality, and the way she could leave every place she went without leaving a piece of herself behind. She was aware, lying in the dark and listening to the nighthawks, that she had already left a piece of herself somewhere in the fields of the Malone Ranch, and she was not yet sure what to do about it. The confrontation with Gareth Pressler came to a head at the end of Rebecca's 3rd week, 2 days after the flood. Pressler arrived with 2 men and a county official named Harker, who had a briefcase and an uncomfortable expression. They rode into the ranch yard in the mid-morning, and demanded to see Eli Malone, and there was a pointed possessiveness in the way Pressler looked around the yard that made Rebecca's instincts sharpen. She was there when Eli came out of the house to meet them. She had been working at the table on the porch with her survey papers spread around her, and she did not pack them up or move away, because she had the right to be there, and she knew information when she saw it. Pressler made his case directly to Eli and to Harker, bypassing Rebecca entirely. His claim was that the rock deflector Eli had placed in the creek 6 years ago had, over time, created a sediment buildup on Pressler's side of the watershed boundary that had contributed to the flood. He had a hand-drawn map, and the testimony of his foreman and what he believed was the common understanding that any modification to a shared waterway created shared liability. Harker looked pained but professionally neutral. Eli looked at Rebecca. Pressler noticed. "This is about property rights and liability," Pressler said, and there was something dangerous in the edge of his voice that Rebecca recognized. It was the tone of a man who had prepared for this conversation and believed he had already won it. "It's not a surveying matter. The basis of your claim is geological," Rebecca said, setting down her pencil. "You are claiming that a physical modification of the creek caused a physical outcome. That is precisely a surveying matter." Pressler looked at her directly for the first time. He was a thick-necked man in his 50s with a neat, trimmed beard and the expensive hat of someone who did well in cattle. His eyes were calculating. "And who are you exactly?" he said. "Rebecca Talmadge, USGS field surveyor," she said. "I have been conducting a full hydrological assessment of this property for 3 weeks. I have a complete sediment and channel analysis that identifies the cause of the Copper Creek rerouting. Shall I get it for you?" Harker's professional neutrality became something more interested. "I would very much like to see that," Harker said. Pressler's jaw tightened. She went inside and came back with her field report. It was 31 pages. She had cross-referenced every measurement, every sample, every date. She handed it to Harker, who opened it and began to read with the careful attention of a man who is deciding how much trouble he is going to be in if he makes the wrong call. Rebecca stood beside Eli. She was aware of him beside her, the steadiness of him, the fact that he had not spoken a word since Pressler arrived beyond the initial greeting because he was letting her work. She explained the report to Harker in clear, direct terms. The freeze-thaw bank failure, the date, the sediment evidence, the complete absence of mechanical causation from any human intervention upstream. The fact that the rock deflector in question was too small, positioned too far downstream, and oriented in the wrong direction to have any measurable effect on the bank failure that occurred at the Oxbow. Harker read. He asked 2 questions that she answered with specific page references. Pressler made 2 interjections that she addressed with the patience of someone who has testified before skeptical audiences and knows that the data wins. When she finished, Harker closed the report and looked at Pressler with an expression that was professionally regretful. "Mr. Pressler," he said, "there is nothing here that supports a liability claim." Pressler's face did something complex. "I'd like to have my own expert look at that report," he said. "You are welcome to," Rebecca said. "My methods are standard. The USGS procedures I used are documented in the Bureau's published guidelines. Any qualified hydrologist will confirm my findings." Pressler looked from Rebecca to Eli and then back at Rebecca, and she saw the moment when he recognized that the ground had shifted under him in a way he had not prepared for. He said something clipped to Harker that she did not quite catch, and then he turned his horse and rode out with his men, and Harker followed with an apologetic tilt of his hat toward Eli. The yard was quiet. Eli let out a long, slow breath beside her. "That," he said carefully, "was something to watch." She picked up her pencil from the porch table. "The data is always there," she said. "People just don't always know how to read it." She went back to her papers. But she was smiling at the page, small and private, and she was fairly certain that he saw it. It was Hatch who finally said the thing that nobody was saying. He came to find her at the survey stakes on the following Thursday afternoon, holding 2 cups of coffee that he had carried from the house with the careful, serious concentration of a man transporting something important. She took the cup. He stood beside her and looked at the creek. "You heading back to Cheyenne when your assessment's done?" he asked. "That's the plan," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You know he's going to be terrible company after you go," he said. She looked at him. Hatch kept looking at the creek. "I've worked for Eli Malone for 11 years, he said. "I worked for his father before him. In 11 years I have not once seen that man come out and sit on the porch in the evening. Not once. He works until dark and he goes inside and he sleeps and he gets up and works again. Since you got here he's been on that porch every night." She did not say anything. "I'm not one for speaking where I'm not needed," Hatch said. "I just thought someone should mention it." He took his coffee cup and walked back toward the barn. Rebecca looked at her survey stakes and the creek and the late afternoon light falling across the bottom pasture in long gold lines, and she stood very still for a moment with the feeling of someone who has just had a door opened that they were not expecting to find in that wall. She finished her final measurements. She went back to the house. She sat down at the porch table with her proposal document and her pencil and she tried to work, and she was still sitting there when the sun went all the way down, and the lamp on the rail made its amber circle and Eli came out and sat on the upper step beside her. They were quiet for a while. The nighthawks were calling. "I've finished the full proposal," she said. "I know," he said. "I read the draft you left on the desk." She looked at him. "All 30 pages. Last night," he said, "and the night before." She was surprised. She tried not to show it. "What did you think?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I think it's the most thorough document I have ever read about this piece of land," he said. "And I think if someone had written it 15 years ago, my father would have fought with it for a week and then done most of it and not admitted why." She laughed, which surprised her. She did not laugh easily. He turned at the sound of it, and his expression was the open one, the one she had been cataloging without meaning to, the one that she was now honest enough with herself to recognize as the expression of a man who was in a great deal of trouble and knew it. "Rebecca," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name. She felt it in a way that was completely unprofessional. "Yes," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady, which cost her something. He looked at her. He seemed to be deciding something with the same focused deliberateness he brought to every decision she had watched him make, and she had the sense that once he decided, the decision would be permanent, and he knew it. "I would like it," he said carefully, "if you were not leaving at the end of next week." She looked back at him for a long moment. "I have a job," she said, "and a rental room in Cheyenne." "I know that," he said. "And I am not the kind of woman who stays somewhere for personal reasons when there is no professional justification," she said. "I know that too," he said. She waited. "I am asking," he said, "whether there might be a professional justification." The creek management proposal covers 7 years of work. The implementation needs someone who understands the plan. The county does not have anyone qualified. The USGS does not typically send the same person back twice. He paused. "But they might, if the rancher in question made a formal request for the specific surveyor who completed the initial assessment." She looked at him. "That is a very logical argument," she said. "I am attempting," he said carefully, "to give you a reason that does not require you to make a decision you are not ready to make." She was quiet for a moment. "Eli," she said, using his first name for the first time, and saw the way his expression changed at it. "I need you to understand something about me." "Tell me," he said. "I do not make decisions with my heart," she said. "I make them with my head, and my head is telling me that I have been on this porch every evening for 2 weeks, and that I have been aware of exactly where you are every hour of every day, and that I have been looking for reasons to extend the upper watershed survey by an extra 2 days. She paused. "My head is telling me that I have already made the decision. I am just looking for the appropriate professional justification." He was very still. "And do you find the argument about the implementation contract convincing?" he asked. "I find it entirely convincing," she said. He reached over and took her hand from where it was resting on the table beside her pencil and held it in both of his, and she looked at their hands and then at him. "Then stay," he said, simply, without condition, without complication. "All right," she said, and the nighthawks called and the lamp burned amber on the rail and Copper Creek ran its new course through the bottom pasture, going exactly where she had told it to go. The summer that followed was the richest of Rebecca Talmadge's life, and also the most difficult, and also the best. She wrote to the USGS field office in Laramie and formally requested assignment to the Malone Ranch implementation project, citing the complexity of the creek management plan and the need for continuity of scientific oversight. Her supervisor, a careful man named Forsyth who had always respected her results if not always her methods, approved the extension with a note that said, "6 months, Miss Talmadge. Report monthly." 6 months became the container for everything. She moved from the bunkhouse loft to the small spare room in the main house that had been, she understood, Eli's sister's room before his sister had married and moved to Colorado 3 years before. It was a clean, quiet room with a window that faced east and caught the morning light, and she set up her drafting table under it and spread her maps across the walls and made it, without quite meaning to, into a home. The implementation of the creek management plan began in July. It was physical, demanding work, and Rebecca was in the field every day, overseeing the placement of the engineered bank deflectors, the seeding of the native grass buffer strips, the installation of the drainage channel through the south pasture bog. Eli and his men did the physical labor under her direction, and she had never worked with a crew that was more willing or more capable. Eli himself she could not stop watching. He was different now that the distance between them had collapsed. He talked more, not in a garrulous way, but in the measured, considered way of someone who has decided to let the conversation go somewhere real. He told her about the ranch, its history, the way the grass changed through the seasons, the names of the hills. He told her about growing up under his father's rigid discipline, about the hidden gentleness of his mother who had died when Eli was 14, about the years of work that had made the Malone Ranch from something struggling into something solid. She told him things she did not tell people. About her father's study lined with maps where she had spent her childhood. About Professor Crane, who had been the first person who had seen her work and said, without qualification or patronizing surprise, that she was exceptional at it. About the work she had done on the North Platte irrigation project, the 3 homesteaders whose crops she had saved, the way it had felt to watch water go where it was supposed to go for people who had needed it desperately. "Is that why you do it?" he asked one evening in mid-July. They were on the porch and the summer dark was enormous and full of stars. "To fix things for people who need it. Partly," she said. "Partly I do it because I love water. I love understanding how it moves. There is nothing that reads the land the way water does. It knows everything about the ground it has passed through, every rock layer, every fault, every soft spot. If you can read a watershed, you can read the history of the land beneath it." She paused. "It's like a language, and I am unreasonably interested in learning languages." He was quiet for a moment. "My father could not read it at all," he said. He looked at the creek and saw a resource. Useful or threatening, nothing in between. "Most people do," she said. "You don't." "No," she said. He looked at her in the starlight. "Tell me what you see when you look at it," he said. She thought about it for a moment. "A long conversation," she said, "between the water and the land, neither of them winning, both of them changing." He reached over and found her hand in the dark, and she let him take it, and they sat like that for a long time without saying anything, and she thought that this specific thing, was what she had not known she was missing. The Pressler situation had not entirely resolved itself. In mid-August, word came through Hatch that Pressler had hired a lawyer from Casper and was still pursuing some version of the liability claim, reframed around property boundary disputes involving the creek's new channel. Since the channel had moved, there was a genuine legal question about where the property line now fell, and Pressler was arguing that the new channel brought a section of what had been Malone land into his effective territory. It was a different kind of battle than the one Rebecca had defeated in the yard. Property law was not hydrology, and Pressler was smarter than he had initially appeared. He had found the one angle that her data could not directly address. Eli was tense for 3 days after the news came, quieter than he had been in weeks, working longer hours, coming to the porch late if at all. She watched him carry the weight of it and was aware that she could not simply solve this the way she had solved the creek, because the tools for this were not in her satchel. On the 3rd evening, she sat down beside him on the upper step and said, "Tell me exactly what the dispute is. Every detail." He told her. She listened without interrupting, and when he was done she said, "The legal boundary follows the original surveyed line, which was established when the property was first deeded. The creek was a secondary reference in the original survey, not the primary boundary marker. The primary marker is a set of iron pins in the ground that do not move when the creek does." He looked at her. "Do you know where those pins are?" she asked. "There should be survey pins along the north line," he said slowly. "I have not looked for them since I bought out the north parcel in '91. "I can find them," she said. "Survey pins are in the original deed documentation. If the USGS has the original territorial survey on record, and they will because they always do, I can locate those pins' described positions and find the physical pins in the ground. If they're still there, which iron pins in clay usually are, they establish the original legal boundary independent of where the creek now runs." He was staring at her. "That defeats Pressler's argument entirely," he said. "If the pins say what I think they say," she said carefully, "but I am fairly confident they will. From the watershed shape and the elevation profiles I have, the original survey would have run the north line well above the creek in any position it has ever occupied. How long would it take you to find them? A week, maybe less if the deed description is precise." He took a breath. "Rebecca," he said, and put his arm around her shoulders, which was a thing he had not done before in quite that way, and she leaned into it without deciding to. "Stop looking at me like that," she said. "Like what?" he said, and she could hear the almost smile in it. "Like I am doing something extraordinary," she said. "I am doing my job." "Maybe," he said. "I think your job is extraordinary." She did not answer that because there was no professional response to it, and she had run out of professional responses to Eli Malone some weeks earlier. She found the survey pins in 6 days. They were iron rods, driven into the clay subsoil at 18-inch depth, exactly where the original 1874 territorial survey described them. In the deed documentation, she had requested via telegram from the Laramie Land Records Office. The original survey description was meticulous, using an 8-point bearing system from a known datum point, and Rebecca walked the north boundary of the Malone property with her compass and her chain, finding each pin in sequence. The boundary ran 40 feet above the highest position the creek channel had ever occupied, according to her own records of the flood crest. Pressler did not have a case. He had never had a case. He had, she understood now, a theory that might have worked if there had been no one on the ground who knew exactly how to read the land's own documentation. The lawyer from Casper withdrew the filing 3 weeks after she submitted her pin survey to the county recorder's office. Hatch brought the news at supper, and there was a brief celebration among the ranch hands that involved a bottle of whiskey and some enthusiastic toasting that Rebecca politely declined to participate in beyond a small glass. Eli looked across the table at her, and the expression on his face was not the surprised one anymore. It was something quieter and more certain, the expression of a man who has stopped being surprised and started simply being glad. That evening on the porch, he said something she had not expected. "Will you stay?" he asked. "Past the 6 months." She looked at him. "The implementation work is not done." "I know," he said. "That's not what I'm asking." The stars were very bright. A night hawk cut across the sky in a long banking glide. "What are you asking?" she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, which was becoming a pattern she had stopped pretending was not happening. He turned to look at her directly. There was nothing ambiguous in his face. He was a man who had decided something with his full deliberateness and was offering it with his full honesty. "I am asking whether you would consider building something here," he said. "With me. This ranch, this land, the creek that refuses to behave itself. I know it is not Cheyenne. I know it is not a surveying office or a salary from the federal government. I know that what I am asking costs more from you than it does from me." He paused. "But I also know that I have not once in my life felt the way I feel on this porch in the evenings, and I am not willing to go back to not feeling it without at least asking." She sat with that for a moment. She thought about her drafting table under the east-facing window, and the maps on the walls and the creek in the bottom pasture that she knew now better than she had ever known any piece of water anywhere. She thought about Hatch and the coffee cups and the way the light fell across the survey stakes in the late afternoon. She thought about 31 pages of field report and iron pins in the clay and water that goes where you give it reason to go. She thought about the nighthawks. "I would not be giving up my work," she said. "I would never ask that," he said immediately. "I have monthly reports to file," she said, "and I would need a good mail connection to Cheyenne and Laramie for ongoing correspondence." "The stage stops at Prospect Hollow twice a week," he said, "and the implementation plan still has 4 years of scheduled monitoring," she said. "Which means you would need to be on site for the monitoring," he said. "Professionally." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. He waited. "Yes to all of it," she said. "Yes to staying." He reached over and took her face in both of his hands very carefully in the way of someone handling something that matters enormously, and she put her hand on his chest and felt his heart, which was not steady at all, and she thought, "This is what the creek is doing. It is going somewhere new. It is following the ground beneath it. It is exactly where it is supposed to be." He kissed her in the lamplight, and the nighthawks called, and Copper Creek ran in its new course through the bottom pasture, healing slowly, the grass coming back along its edges in a widening fringe of green. They were married in October. It was a small wedding, in the way of the country, held at the ranch because Rebecca had no family close enough to travel, and Eli's sister Clara came down from Colorado with her husband and their 2 small children, and declared the whole thing exactly right. Clara Malone was a bright-eyed woman with her brother's directness and a laugh that carried across the yard, and she took Rebecca's hands when they first met and said, "He wrote me about you. He said you were the most remarkable person he had ever met. I think he undersold it." Rebecca had not known what to do with that, so she had simply said thank you. The ceremony was conducted by a circuit minister who came through Prospect Hollow on the 2nd Saturday of each month, a compact and cheerful man named Reverend Plimpton, who performed marriages with genuine enthusiasm and a pleasantly brief style. Hatch stood as Eli's witness. A woman from the town of Prospect Hollow named Dorothea Crane, no relation to Professor Crane, who had become a cautious friend during Rebecca's supply runs to town, stood as hers. Rebecca wore a dress she had ordered from the dry goods store in Cheyenne, dark blue wool with ivory buttons, practical enough for the country, and with enough structure to feel like an occasion. She had not owned a dress for years that was not practical enough for the country. She had ordered it with a feeling that was slightly foreign to her, a particular private pleasure she did not name. Eli wore his best coat and a new shirt, and an expression of such complete and settled happiness that several of the ranch hands found things to do near the fence line that didn't require them to account for the state of their eyes. They exchanged vows as the afternoon light came down across the valley in long gold sheets, and the creek ran, visible from the yard, in its settling channel with the native grass buffer already a hand's width above the soil on the restored banks. At the supper afterward, Hatch made a toast that was entirely about the sandbag line and not at all about the wedding, and yet managed to be, Rebecca thought, exactly the right thing to say. The first winter of their marriage was the kind that tests what has been built. It was brutal by anyone's measure. The kind of Wyoming winter that makes the sky seem like a roof being pressed down on the world. The temperatures dropped below zero for 11 consecutive days in January, and the work of keeping the ranch running in those conditions was constant and physical and genuinely hard. Rebecca was no stranger to cold or to physical work, but running a ranch household through a Wyoming winter was a scale of effort she was still learning. She learned it with the same methodical attention she brought to everything else. She managed the household accounts, which had been handled loosely and not entirely efficiently before. She organized the feed inventory with the same systematic approach she used for her field data, which resulted in considerably better rationing through the lean months. She continued her monitoring visits to the creek, even in the cold, taking her measurements at scheduled intervals because the data continuity mattered, wrapping herself in her heavy coat and making the trek to the survey stakes while the breath came off her in white clouds. Eli watched her do this. On one of those mornings, deep in January, he pulled on his coat and his hat and went with her without being asked. They walked down to the creek together in the silent cold, the snow compacted under their boots, the sky a flat white above the hills. She set up her measuring rod at the water's edge and read the gauge level and recorded it in her notebook with her pencil, which she had to warm in her gloved hands first. He stood beside her and watched, and then, without her asking, held the rod steady at the exact angle she needed while she took the reading. She looked up at him from the notebook, and he was watching her with that expression, the one she knew now as his true face, the open one, the glad one. "Thank you," she said. "It's your creek," he said. "I'm just helping." She tucked the notebook away. "It's your creek too, you know." He looked at the water for a moment, the way it moved dark and deliberate between its new banks. "It didn't feel like mine until you explained it to me," he said. She took his arm as they walked back through the snow toward the house and thought about that sentence for a long time. Spring came with its usual drama, the thaw noisy and forceful and transformative. Rebecca monitored the creek through every stage of it, watching the new channel handle the snowmelt with the managed grace of her bank deflectors and the stabilizing root systems of the native grasses, which were in their second season and beginning to develop the deep mats that would, in another 2 or 3 years, make the banks nearly invulnerable to normal flood events. The south pasture bog had drained completely. The acreage was dry by mid-April, and Eli was able to put cattle on it by May, adding the grazing area that the flood had cost him back to the productive ledger of the ranch. He said nothing dramatic about it. He just moved the cattle onto the new pasture and watched them go with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has seen something come right. She was watching him watch the cattle when she told him. "I need to tell you something," she said. He turned from the fence and looked at her. She had calculated, with her customary precision, that the timing was early enough to be confident about. She had been waiting for the certainty before she said anything, because she was not a woman who spoke before she was certain. "We are going to have a child," she said. The expression that crossed his face was something she had never seen from him before and would never entirely forget. It was not the open expression or the impressed one or the glad one. It was something larger than all of those, something that seemed to involve his entire being reorganizing itself around a new fact that it was, she could see, very ready to accommodate. He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and held her face in his hands the way he always did, with that careful, enormous tenderness, and he looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice was rough. "I am perfectly well," she said and smiled. He pulled her against his chest, his arms around her, his chin at the top of her head, and she felt his heart the way she had felt it on the porch the night she had said yes to all of it. Not steady, full. "When?" he asked. "October," she said. "Approximately. I am not imprecise about measurements." He laughed, his chest moving with it, and she laughed too, and the cattle grazed in the south pasture that had been a bog, and the creek ran clean and contained in its new banks, and the hills were green with the first real grass of the year. Their son was born on the 7th of November, a Tuesday, As the first serious snow of the season came down in big soft flakes outside the window of the room where Rebecca had been working on her monitoring reports not 3 days before. They named him Thomas, for Rebecca's father, and James for Eli's, making a bridge between two histories in a single small person who arrived at the world with his father's dark hair and his mother's precise, alert expression and an extremely emphatic opinion about being hungry. Clara came from Colorado again and stayed for 6 weeks and was invaluable in ways that Rebecca was grateful for with a depth that surprised her. She had not expected to need help. She had expected to manage, which was different. Being allowed to be helped was something she had to learn, and Clara made it easy by framing everything as practical and obvious rather than as charity or concern. Eli was a father in the way she might have predicted, serious about it, completely devoted, and quietly delighted in a way that leaked through his usual containment in small and charming ways. She found him at 2 in the morning standing at the cradle with Thomas in his arms, not because the baby was crying, but because he had wanted to hold him. He had looked up when she appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man caught at something that he was entirely unashamed of. "Go back to sleep," he said quietly. "He's asleep already," she said, looking at Thomas's closed eyes. "I know," he said. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the two of them. "You are very good at that," she said. "At what?" "Holding the things that matter," she said. He looked at her across the dark room and the quiet baby. "I learned from watching you," he said. She went back to bed, but she lay awake for a while, looking at the dark ceiling with a feeling that was not quite any word she knew. It was something in the territory beyond the edge of her vocabulary, large and warm and permanent. The second year of the implementation plan brought a new challenge that Rebecca had not anticipated, though in hindsight she thought she should have. The railroad company sent surveyors through the valley in the summer with talk of a new spur line that would run through the eastern edge of the Malone property, and critically, would require significant grading work in the area of the restored creek channel. The grading proposal, as initially presented, would have undermined everything she had built in 2 years of careful work. The bank stability, the native grass buffer, the engineered deflectors, all of it vulnerable to the mass earth movement that the railroad's plan called for. She attended the initial public meeting in Prospect Hollow with Thomas on her hip and her field notebooks in her satchel and her professional credentials in her coat pocket, and she sat in the 3rd row of the meeting hall and waited for the railroad's engineer to finish his presentation. When he finished, she stood up. She was 30 years old, and she had been in enough contentious rooms to know how to fill one. She set Thomas on the bench beside Eli, who had come with her, and walked to the front of the room, and she laid out the case for creek channel protection with the same completeness and precision that had stopped Pressler's lawsuit and directed 3 hours of sandbag work in the flood rain. The railroad engineer listened. He was, she was somewhat surprised to find, a reasonable man named Holbrook who was genuinely interested in the technical argument and not merely performing interest. They went 3 rounds on the grading proposal, Rebecca presenting the hydraulic consequences of each version, Holbrook adjusting his plan in response to the constraints she identified. By the end of the meeting, the spur line had been rerouted 70 feet to the east, clear of the restored channel's buffer zone. The ranchers and farmers in the meeting hall applauded. Rebecca picked Thomas back up and sat down beside Eli, who had not said a word during the entire exchange. He had simply sat there with his arms folded and his dark eyes steady, watching her work. "That was something," he said quietly. "It was a reasonable engineer," she said. "The worst cases are the ones who have already decided the technical argument doesn't apply to them." "No," he said, and there was something in his voice that was different from the usual. She looked at him. "That was you being extraordinary," he said. "You should let it be that." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. Thomas grabbed her braid and she gently detached his fingers, and Eli took him so she could rewrap her notebooks, and around them the room was dispersing, and outside the window the valley lay in its summer gold, and somewhere in the bottom pasture of the Malone Ranch, Copper Creek ran in its new course, stable and channeled and beautifully, thoroughly understood. The 4 years of the implementation plan passed in the way that good years pass, full of specific texture and particular moments rather than a generalized blur. The creek stabilized completely by the 3rd year. The bank deflectors had done their work. The native grass buffer had developed into a dense root system that was holding the banks through every weather event the Wyoming seasons threw at them, and the channel had found the equilibrium that Rebecca had calculated it would find. She submitted her formal monitoring reports to the USGS quarterly, and they were published as a technical case study in the Bureau's annual survey review, the first case study from a Wyoming watershed management project, the first authored by a woman. She received a letter from Professor Crane in Laramie, her old professor, who wrote, "I have read the Malone Creek study 3 times. It is the finest application of field hydrology I have encountered in 30 years. Well done, Rebecca." She kept the letter in her desk drawer, and on the day it arrived she read it twice and then went out to the porch and stood in the evening air for a while, feeling something she identified as the particular satisfaction of work that has mattered. Their second child arrived 2 months after the completion of the formal implementation plan, a daughter they named Ellen, for Eli's mother. She had Rebecca's dark hair and Eli's brown eyes and Thomas's aggressive appetite for motion, and the house, which had been quietly joyful with one child, became something louder and more complicated and entirely wonderful. Hatch, who was now 58 and had not noticeably mellowed, built Ellen a small toy box from pine boards as a birth gift, bringing it to the house with the careful expression of a man performing an extremely professional task who absolutely did not have a soft interior. Rebecca thanked him with genuine warmth, and Hatch said it was just some spare wood and walked back to the barn without looking at any of them. "He cried," Eli said later. "I know," Rebecca said. "I'm not going to tell him I saw." Thomas was 3 when Ellen was born, and he received his sister with the mixed enthusiasm of a small person who was not entirely certain about the new development but was willing to reserve judgment. By the time Ellen was 6 months old, he had decided she was extremely useful as an audience and was spending most of his time performing for her, with varying results. Rebecca watched her children and felt the particular richness of a life that has become more than she had built it to contain. She had built her life to be sufficient for herself, competent and mobile and free. What she had been given instead was something much larger and more complicated and entirely beyond her original specifications, and she had come to believe that this was not a failure of planning, but a discovery that planning had not anticipated. She still worked. She had a formal consultancy arrangement with the USGS by the 4th year, which allowed her to conduct field assessments for other ranches and farms in the territory without being a full-time staff member. It was the arrangement she had not known to ask for at the beginning, the professional recognition she had earned, and the geographic flexibility to do the work from where she lived rather than where an office told her to be. She rode out on Scout, who was 12 now and still sound, with Thomas sometimes when the distance was manageable and the work site appropriate for a small person with a large interest in measuring rods. Eli had given Thomas his first real pony at age 4, a thick-necked gray named Buckwheat, and Thomas approached riding with the methodical confidence of a child raised between 2 parents who believed that understanding something mattered more than pretending it was easy. The 5th year after the flood, in the late spring, Rebecca rode the full perimeter of the creek channel with her notebook, completing what she had privately decided would be her final formal monitoring assessment. The channel did not need her monitoring anymore. It was stable. It was healthy. The native grasses were established and self-sustaining. The bank deflectors had settled into the substrate permanently, and the creek was running its new course with the calm authority of something that has found where it belongs. She sat on Scout at the old Oxbow Bend, where the collapse had happened, where the freeze-thaw failures in the clay matrix had started the whole chain of events that had brought her to this valley. The exposed bank had healed over completely. There was no trace of the slump feature she had documented so carefully. The land had closed over its own wound, as land does, as time allows. She sat there for a while and looked at the water. She heard hoofbeats behind her and turned to find Eli coming across the bottom pasture on his big roan, which was the same color as Scout though considerably larger. He came up beside her and stopped, and they both looked at the creek. "Checking on it," he asked. "Saying goodbye to the formal work," she said. "It's done." He looked at the bank and the water and the grass. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think it's exactly where it should be," she said. He reached over from the saddle and found her hand, and they stayed on their horses at the edge of the old oxbow in the spring morning, the creek moving below them, the hills green with the new season, the sound of the water against the stone and the grass and the roots of the things that had been planted to hold everything together. "So are we," he said. She tightened her hand around his. They rode back to the house in the morning light, side by side, the hooves of their horses quiet in the new grass. At the gate to the yard, they could hear Thomas from inside the house doing something loud and opinionated about breakfast, and Ellen's answering sound, which was not yet words but was definitely argument. Eli opened the gate and held it for her with an ease that was not ceremony, just habit, just the daily fact of moving through their life together. She rode through, and he followed and closed the gate behind them. On the porch, the lamp that burned at night was dark in the morning light, but she remembered every evening it had burned amber, and the table covered in her notebooks and the upper step where he had come to sit beside her without asking, night after night, until they had run out of professional distance and arrived at something truer and more permanent. She swung down from Scout and handed the reins to one of the younger ranch hands who had appeared from the barn, with the morning efficiency of the place that was always moving, always working, always tended. Inside the house, Thomas was negotiating loudly with the cook about whether biscuits counted as breakfast or whether eggs were required, and Ellen was contributing to the noise in her own determined way. The morning light was coming through the east-facing window of the room where Rebecca's drafting table stood under her maps, the maps that showed the watershed and the creek and the property line and the iron pins and the sediment layers and the 4 years of monthly measurements that had become a scientific record and a personal history simultaneously. Eli came up behind her on the porch and put his hand at the small of her back, warm and certain, the way he always did, and she leaned into it for a moment before they went inside to the children and the biscuit dispute, and the ordinary extraordinary life that the creek had started by rerouting through the bottom pasture on a February morning 5 years ago. She thought, briefly and quietly, of what she had said to Eli on one of those early porch evenings. That the creek was a long conversation between the water and the land, that neither of them was winning, that both of them were changing. She had been right about that. She had not known yet that she was also describing herself. That she was the water and this was the land, or maybe the other way around, or maybe both at once, the way it actually is when two lives reroute around each other and find, in the new channel they have carved together, the exact ground they were always meant to be passing through. "Are you coming in?" Eli asked from the doorway. "Yes," she said. She took his hand and went inside. The creek ran on behind her, clear and contained and permanent, through the bottom pasture where the grass grew thick along its edges, all the way to the eastern depression where it spread and quieted and disappeared into the deep gravel of the aquifer, returning to the earth that had always been its final destination, as everything eventually returns to where it belongs.